I didn't plan for love to arrive. Dressed as an accident, the farmhouse sat out on a stretch of county road, where cell service gave up halfway through the hills. It looked like a place that used to belong to someone with a different kind of patience, clapboard patched in places, old stone foundation, exposed like a scar that never fully healed. The realtor called it charming, I called it survivable, because I was buying it with the kind of hope that tries to pretend it doesn't need proof. Caleb write me seller, my contractor turned owner, and somehow the only man who could explain every crack in the floorboard with a calm confidence agreed to the last showing the week before closing. He'd been doing renovations in phases, always just one step ahead of the weather. New beams in the attic, plumbing rerouted, insulation that made the rooms stop smelling like damp, the kind of work that made my future feel real. When I finally walked through the house for the contract walkthrough, the air was cool and clean in that newly opened way. The dining room windows were draped in plastic to protect paint. Dust glittered in the late afternoon sun. Caleb moved slowly, like he was listening to the structure of the house as much as he was talking. He showed me the kitchen first, white cabinetry installed, but not finished, a countertop leaning against the wall, like it was waiting to be claimed. Then he led me to the back room where the old plaster had been removed. The studs were exposed, raw wood, pale against the darker beams. He pointed at a beam and said, "This one's the anchor. If you pull the wrong thing, the whole place complains." I laughed, because I didn't know what else to do. "It complains already?" "It complains," Caleb said. His voice didn't rise, but something about his honesty made it land. "That's why I'm selling. Not because I can't finish, because I can't live inside unfinished mistakes anymore." I didn't ask what his mistakes were. In my life, I'd learned that people offered details when they were ready, and I'd built a career out of respecting that kind of timing. But the way he looked at the ceiling, as if he could hear the house's complaints, made me feel like there were things he didn't say because silence was safer. After the walkthrough, he offered to stay late and lock up. "If you want, come back tomorrow. There's one more section in the crawl that I'll fix before we seal it. I just don't like the idea of you signing while it's still open." "Thanks," I said, and I meant it. I meant it so much that I didn't notice what I was doing, how I was making his presence part of my routine already. That next day, I returned with a coffee in a paper cup that was too hot to hold. The sky was low and grey, threatening rain. The farmhouse driveway had a thin layer of mud, slick as oil, and my shoes sank when I stepped out of the car. I could smell wet earth through the open garage doors. Caleb was already there when I arrived. He moved with the focus of someone who'd spent years making his body obey his plans. Work, boots, gloves. A tool belt that looked worn in the same way people get worn by trying hard. He stood near the back wall with a carpenter's pencil behind his ear, squinting at a section of scaffolding. "You're early," he said. "I live in early," I replied, and he smiled. It was a small smile, private, like he didn't want to waste it on me until he knew I deserved it. Then the older man showed up. Theo Hammond, Caleb's neighbour, the one people in town called reliable, as if that could stand in for every other quality. I'd seen Theo at a community pickup once, the kind of event where you pretended not to notice everyone was watching. Theo had offered to carry bags, to stack chairs, to fix a leaky spigot without being asked. He was the sort of person who could make the rest of the world feel like it was behaving. Theo was also, apparently, supposed to be straight. That word floated through towns like a protective charm. People used it the way some people use safe or normal. Caleb told me later, quietly, after the introductions and the polite distance. But on that first day, Theo was just there, hands in pockets, jacket unzipped, eyes scanning the work like he'd done it himself. "Caleb says you're the buyer," Theo called out, voice warm. "You staying long?" I didn't know what to answer. The truth was complicated. I was staying until my life stabilized enough to stop feeling temporary. "Long enough to finish the move," I said. "Good," Theo replied, and then he looked at Caleb. Let's not rush it. Caleb nodded, but I saw his jaw set in a way that told me he wasn't rushing. It was just that he couldn't afford to hesitate. There were invisible deadlines hovering over him. By instinct knew it. Maybe it was money, maybe it was time, maybe it was grief. The scaffolding was set up along the back wall, where the ceiling had been repaired and reopened. Caleb had been replacing rotten boards. He climbed carefully, checking his footing, measuring, adjusting the angle of a beam. I watched from the kitchen door, shifting my weight, trying not to hover. Theo stayed near the bottom, offering small help, handing a level here, steadying a plank there. I noticed how his hands moved. Not just helpful, practiced. When Caleb stepped onto the upper platform, he leaned forward to reach a bundle of wires tucked behind old paneling. The daylight through the window made his hair glow faintly around the edges. For a second I thought about how ordinary he looked and how impossible it felt that his life could ever go wrong. Then the sound happened. It wasn't loud at first, just a low creak, a long groan like wood protesting. The kind of sound that makes your brain go silent because it knows before you do that something is wrong. Caleb's body reacted faster than his mind. He looked down, eyes widening. His hand flew to the beam, but the scaffolding wasn't asking him for permission. A rung shifted. A bolt. Maybe it had been loosened already, or maybe the rain made it slip, gave way. There was a brief, awful moment where I could see the angle changing. The platform pitched. Caleb's feet lost alignment. I moved without thinking. I crossed the kitchen floor so fast, my shoes slid on the wood. Theo was already moving too, his weight forward, reaching, trying to grab Caleb by the belt. Everything happened at once. Caleb's shoulder twisted as he fell. His elbow slammed against the edge of a beam. He hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of him like the house exhaled through him. I heard a sickening crack, not from his bones, not exactly, but from the impact that convinced my body it was too late. Theo's voice cut through the air.
Caleb, hey, look at me.
Caleb tried to speak, but all that came out was a rough, broken sound. His eyes fluttered, unfocused, then snapped back in a way that looked like pain fighting for control. I knelt beside him, hands hovering, because I didn't know what was safe to touch. His shirt was stained immediately, darkening along his side. The smell of dust and sweat and something metallic came up with the shock. "Don't move," I said, and my voice sounded too calm, like I was reading it from somewhere else. Theo pressed a hand to Caleb's shoulder, gentle but firm. "You're not alone," he told him. "Help is coming. We need." Caleb tried again, and the words seemed to hurt him. "Water. Phone." Theo nodded and kept his other hand on Caleb's arm like he was anchoring a boat in rough water. My thoughts were, chaos dressed up as action. I grabbed my phone with a shaking grip, thumbs fumbling. When I called emergency services, my voice kept catching on disbelief. While I was waiting for the dispatcher to answer, I looked at Caleb's face. His skin had gone pale in patches, and sweat slicked his forehead. His lips were parted as if he couldn't decide whether to breathe through his nose or mouth. In the dim light of the unfinished room, he looked younger than I'd seen him. Less, a man selling a home, and more a person just trying to survive. When the sirens finally arrived, the sound was both distant and immediate. Neighbors started showing up, drawn by the flash of emergency lights. People asked questions. Someone offered to unlock a side gate. Everyone's voice overlapped until I couldn't separate them. But through it all, Theo stayed close. At some point, Caleb's body stopped fighting the pain long enough for his eyes to focus on Theo's face. Their gaze held in a way that made something twist in my chest. I wasn't sure what it was: worry, gratitude, history, an unspoken language. Caleb looked at Theo like someone who had been saved before and didn't want to owe anyone again. Then Caleb's eyes flicked to me. He managed a whisper. "You got here fast." I moved, I said. My hands were still pressed against the edge of his jeans, not touching the injury directly, but close enough that I felt the heat of his body through fabric. I'm here. Theo watched me, and I realized then that Theo wasn't only helping Caleb. He was watching me too, like he was measuring whether I would run, whether I would panic, whether I would become another person. Caleb would have to manage. When paramedics lifted Caleb onto the stretcher, Theo walked beside it. I walked too, close enough that my shoulder nearly brushed Theo's. The space between us felt tight, not because we were physically forced together, but because my emotions were in the ambulance. Caleb was strapped down gently. His jaw clenched as they checked his injuries. He reached, weakly, clumsily, and grabbed Theo's wrist. Theo didn't flinch. He held Caleb's hand like it belonged there. Caleb's breathing became shallow. His eyes darted, restless, scanning the corners of the ambulance, as if he expected the pain to chase him. "Stay with me," he whispered. Theo leaned close, voice barely audible under the paramedic's routine. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere," Caleb exhaled. Like those words were a rope thrown across a gap. I sat in the front seat behind the driver, with a paper bag from the farmhouse in my lap, because I didn't know what to do with my hands. I watched Theo through the glass and thought about how easily my mind tried to turn this into something simple, something like straight neighbor, helps, injured man, buyer witnesses, story ends. But my body wasn't letting me believe the neat version. I kept replaying the moment Caleb fell, the moment Theo grabbed at him, the moment their hands locked. I kept replaying the look Caleb gave Theo when the pain threatened to steal his control, and I couldn't ignore my own memory, how quickly I moved, how my panic turned into focus around Caleb's face, how I wanted to protect him so badly it felt like a new kind of instinct, one I didn't earn. That night, in the hospital waiting room, the atmosphere was fluorescent and too bright for grief. The chairs were hard. The vending machines hummed. People talked in low voices that sounded like bargaining. Caleb was in surgery when we arrived. Theo and me told the same story to the same nurses. It was a story we weren't finished living yet. When Caleb's surgeon finally stepped out, Theo stood with the kind of stillness that told me he'd done this before, or at least imagined it enough to survive it. I wanted to step away, but my feet wouldn't obey. The surgeon explained injuries in careful terms. He had a head impact. Nothing catastrophic, but we caught it early. There's bruising, likely a concussion. The shoulder's going to be painful for a while. He also had some internal bruising from the fall, monitoring overnight. Theo's shoulders dropped a fraction when he heard those words. I watched his face carefully. His eyes didn't look relieved the way mine felt. They looked guarded, like relief might break something if it came too fast. "Will he be okay?" Theo asked. The surgeon nodded. "He will need rest, but yes, we're optimistic." I thought I saw Theo swallow. I thought I saw his throat move like he was forcing down a prayer. Later, when we were allowed to see Caleb, the room smelled like antiseptic and bland coffee. Caleb lay under a thin blanket, his skin paler than before, a bandage along his head. Machines beeped with clinical patience. Theo moved to the bedside and took Caleb's hand again. Caleb's eyes fluttered open slowly. When he saw Theo, something softened in his expression, despite the pain. It wasn't a smile, it was recognition. "I thought," Caleb murmured, voice rough, "that." I was done. Theo's thumb stroked Caleb's knuckles small and steady. "You're not done." Caleb's eyes shifted, and for a moment his gaze went right to me. That look wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was something like apology, like he was asking permission to keep existing. "I'm sorry," Caleb whispered. "For what?" I asked, heart banging against my ribs. "For making you witness me like that." Theo gave him a brief look, warning or comfort. I couldn't tell. Caleb had always seemed controlled when he talked about beams and plans. Seeing him vulnerable made the room tilt. I leaned closer. I didn't mind. I would have done anything. The words shocked me as soon as they left my mouth. Anything wasn't a casual phrase. Anything was a promise, shaped like desperation. Caleb blinked, slow. Theo's eyes flicked to me again, this time with something sharper than before. Then Caleb's eyelids drooped as sleep pulled him down. Theo stayed with him until the nurses asked him to step out. When Theo finally turned away from Caleb, it was like the air changed. His face looked tired now, not just from fear, but from carrying it. "You're the buyer," Theo said to me, voice neutral. "Mill's right." I nodded, startled that he remembered my name. Theo adjusted his jacket. "What did you see?" "Me?" I repeated, confused. "In the fall," he clarified. "Did you see what happened? Did you feel like it was worse than it should have been?" I thought about the creek, the angle, the speed of everything. "Yes," I said quietly. It felt like the house tried to take him. Like it was warning us too late. Theo stared at the floor for a beat. "Happens," he said. "Sometimes the warnings come in the wrong language I didn't know how to answer. Not because there wasn't anything to say, but because I felt like every word might turn into something too intimate." We walked back to our cars after visiting hours. The parking lot was slick from a light mist. Headlights smeared in the wet air. The world felt far away, even though we were still in the same town. Theo walked beside me for a few minutes. His hand hovered near my elbow once, not touching. He seemed to reconsider something mid-motion. "Caleb's stubborn," Theo said finally. "He didn't act stubborn when he was on the floor," I replied. Theo gave a short, almost humorless laugh. "That's because pain doesn't care about personality." I watched his profile as he spoke. Theo's face in the streetlight had a different texture, softer at the edges, harder in the eyes. He was older than me by a few years, but he carried himself like someone who'd spent a long time managing other people's emergencies. Then, without warning, Theo stopped near the driver's side of my car. He looked at me directly. And he said, "You didn't run." It sounded like a sentence you'd say to someone when you couldn't say the sentence you actually meant. I forced myself to meet his gaze. I couldn't. Theo's breath shuddered. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked away like the next words might cost him something. "I'm straight," he said, abrupt, like he was throwing a rope to keep both of us from falling into a deep water too fast. The confession hung between us, ridiculous and heavy. Not because it was new information, town gossip didn't matter in the hospital hallway, but because it was offered like an emergency blanket. "I wasn't asking," I replied. "I know," Theo said. His voice was careful. "But you're looking at Caleb." My stomach tightened. I was helping. He was injured. Theo's eyes sharpened, then softened again. "Sure," he said. "Help. That's what you call it." A silence stretched. I could hear distant car doors slamming. I could hear the faint beeping of a truck reversing down the road. I could hear my own pulse. Theo finally moved, opened his own car door, and got in without another word. I drove back to my apartment, temporary still, because I hadn't officially moved into the farmhouse yet. The place felt wrong. Empty rooms make your thoughts too loud. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands until they stopped shaking. Then I replayed everything. Caleb's eyes when he whispered, "Sorry," Theo's thumb stroking his knuckles. Theo's confession that he was straight. I told myself it was normal to feel grateful. I told myself it was normal to feel rattled by an accident. But my body refused to cooperate. It kept remembering the way Caleb looked when he reached for Theo's wrist. It kept remembering the warmth I'd felt when I grabbed Caleb's jeans during the fall. How protective instinct became something more primal. And then it remembered Theo, how he didn't flinch away from vulnerability. How his presence had been steady, not performative. How he'd stood beside Caleb like a promise. I wanted to hate myself for thinking about Theo, because Theo was supposed to be straight. The label was meant to keep the world orderly. But labels didn't stop the way my chest ached when I pictured Theo's hand on Caleb's. I tried to sleep and couldn't. At 2:17 a.m., My phone lit up with a message from Caleb. Caleb, I don't know if I'm allowed to text, but I woke up. Are you still there? I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. I typed back slowly. Miles. I'm here. How's your head? A minute passed. Caleb thumping. But I'm okay. Theo stayed until the nurse chased him out. He won't admit it, but he's worried. I swallowed hard. Caleb's voice in the message didn't sound like the controlled builder I'd met. It sounded raw, honest, like the pain had stripped away his filters. Miles, you scared everyone. Caleb, I scared myself. I keep thinking about how fast everything happened. 1 second I was reaching, the next I was falling, and the only thing I could think was I waited. The typing bubble appeared and disappeared. Caleb, I didn't get to say what I mean. My throat tightened so fast it hurt. I didn't know what I meant to him, not yet. I didn't know what he meant to me either, but I knew I couldn't let the moment pass. Miles, what do you mean? Another pause. Caleb, I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to witness me, and that I didn't expect Theo to be the one who caught me with his voice. My hands hovered over the keyboard. Miles, you're not alone. Caleb, I know, but I'm not asking that. I'm asking if you ever feel like you're holding your breath. I stared at those words until I felt nauseous. It was too accurate, too intimate. It was like Caleb had crawled into my chest and touched something I'd been keeping locked. I typed and deleted 3 times. Finally, I sent Miles. All the time, the reply came almost instantly. Caleb, then you understand what it's like when I'm selling a house while my life is still under construction. I read it twice, then again. Then, before I could decide if I was brave enough, I texted Miles. I don't just understand it. I think I'm starting to care. I hit send, and instantly felt like I'd thrown myself off a cliff. Caleb responded at 2:41 a.m. Caleb. Care isn't supposed to feel like a bruise. I closed my eyes. When morning came, Theo arrived at the hospital at the same time as my messages. The waiting room had that stale coffee smell again. Caleb looked better when they moved him from surgery, recovery to observation. His eyes still had a shadow, but he was awake, alert enough to pretend he wasn't hurting. Theo pushed through the door like he was still carrying the night. I brought soup, Theo said, holding up a container. Caleb's eyes softened. Theo! Theo's mouth twitched, like he wanted to be strong and couldn't quite manage it. Eat. Caleb lifted a spoon. You sound like my mother. Theo's gaze flicked away, then back. I sound like someone who doesn't want to lose you. The sentence was quiet, but it landed with weight. Caleb's hand trembled slightly as he held the spoon. I watched. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. Caleb looked at Theo with a kind of exhaustion that was almost tenderness. You can't keep saying things like that, he whispered. We're Sloke. Theo's eyes sharpened, then stopped needing it. My chest tightened. I felt like a third object in a room where 2 people had finally admitted something without permission. I cleared my throat. I can go, I offered, because I didn't want to trap them in their own honesty. Theo glanced at me, then nodded. Give him a second. I stepped outside the room, but the hall felt too thin. I listened like a thief. From inside, Caleb's voice came low. You don't have to be like this, Theo. You have. I'm not doing it for me, Theo replied. Caleb exhaled. Yes, you are. Theo's pause was long enough that I almost walked away from my own curiosity. Then Theo said, I'm straight. My heart hammered, not because Theo needed to repeat it, but because it sounded like a defense crammed into a confession. Caleb's response was softer. I know. Then Caleb said something that made my skin go cold. Caleb, but you're still here. I leaned against the wall and let my head rest for a moment. The farmhouse wasn't even mine yet, and already I was watching love happen in a hospital room. When Caleb was discharged 2 days later, the world felt gentler and crueler at the same time. The bruising on his shoulder was visible even through a sling. He moved carefully, like his body was reading instructions from pain. Theo insisted on driving him home. I rode along because I couldn't imagine leaving Caleb alone again, not when the accident had already taught me how fragile everything was. The farmhouse looked different in daylight, after all the sirens. It was still under renovation, still full of exposed wood and plastic sheeting. The scaffolding stood in the back room, like a silent witness. Caleb's gaze lingered on it. When he noticed my eyes, he gave a strained laugh. "I keep thinking," he said, voice hoarse, "about where my hand was when it started to go. Like if I can replay it enough, I can stop it from happening again." Theo glanced at him. "You can't control bolts." Caleb's smile was thin. "No. But I can control whether I keep pretending I'm invincible." I didn't know why that sentence made my stomach twist. Maybe because I recognized it too. The way we pretend safety is a permanent state. After the truck rolled into the driveway, Caleb turned slightly in his seat and looked at me. "Thank you," he said. The words felt plain, but his eyes weren't. "For coming fast, for staying, for not treating me like a liability." I wanted to respond with something profound. I wanted to say, "I didn't just come because you're the seller. I came because something about you got under my skin in the days before you fell." But I only managed, "You needed help." I swallowed. I wanted to be there. Theo watched me again, his attention like a hand on my shoulder. Caleb's brows lifted slightly. "Wanted," he repeated. I could have backed away from that word. Instead, I nodded once. "Wanted," I admitted. Caleb's throat moved. Then, "Maybe you're not as good at pretending as you think." I stared at him. Theo cleared his throat, looking out the windshield, like he needed the road to be real. "Let's take this inside," he said. "You can't keep talking about feelings when you're still bruised." Caleb gave Theo a look that was half gratitude, half plea. "I can't stop." Theo didn't argue. Inside the farmhouse, we moved slowly. Caleb insisted I help carry a bag of supplies, because he needed to feel useful. Theo insisted on checking every doorway for stability, as if the house might retaliate out of spite. Their teamwork was quiet. Not the kind you'd see online. It was the kind you earn over years by learning how someone needs you. As they worked, I felt like I was watching a dance I wasn't invited to. I was the buyer, the one with money and plans. I was supposed to be outside the emotional circle, but the truth was, I wasn't outside. I was already tangled. Later that afternoon, when the rain started steady, soft enough to blur edges, the three of us ended up in the living room by the fireplace that wasn't finished yet. There was no flame, just a room temperature chill and the smell of sawdust. Caleb sat with a blanket over his shoulder, wincing every time he moved wrong. Theo stood near the window, arms crossed, like he was guarding the view. I sat on the floor because chairs felt too formal for what we'd been through. The silence stretched, uncomfortable in the way truth always is. I said, "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. The hospital thing, the texts." Caleb's eyes met mine. "You did," he said honestly. Then he shook his head like he regretted how blunt it came out. "Not uncomfortable, like hostile. Uncomfortable, like it mattered." Theo's jaw tightened. "I'm trying not to." I started, then stopped. What was I trying not to do? Confess. Fall. Bleed sincerity into a room where Theo was supposed to be straight. Caleb waited, not pushing. His patience made my chest ache. I said finally, "I didn't expect my future to start with a crash." Theo's voice came quiet. "It doesn't." Caleb looked at Theo. "What does it start with then?" Theo hesitated. The rain tapped on the window in small rhythmic knocks. Theo said, "It starts with noticing who stays." I felt my heart punch forward. Caleb exhaled. "Then you noticed." Theo didn't deny it. My mind raced, but my body stayed still. There was a difference between panic and listening, and right now, I was listening. Theo said, I stayed because he needed me. I stayed because I couldn't leave him alone. Caleb's voice softened. You stayed because you wanted to be the person he could reach. Theo's eyes snapped to Caleb. Stop. Caleb didn't stop. No. You want to say you're straight so you can keep the story clean, but it's not clean. Theo's hands unclenched slowly. He looked tired. Not physically this time. Tired in the way people get when they've been repeating a sentence like a spell for too long. Are you trying to make me admit it? Theo asked. Caleb's eyes glistened, but his voice didn't break. No, he said. I'm trying to make you stop lying to yourself. The words made the air thicken. I didn't know where to put myself in that conversation. I wasn't the main character in their honesty, but I wasn't outside of it either. My life had split open at the moment Caleb fell. And now Theo was looking at Caleb like the label straight was a wall he'd been leaning against for years. The temptation to escape came hard. I could stand up, go to the kitchen, busy my hands with fixing something. I could keep my feelings secret and pretend I was only a buyer. But the accident had already proven that pretending doesn't protect you. So I stayed on the floor. I said softly, I don't think you can keep calling it clean when it already hurt you. Theo's gaze shifted to me, and I saw something in his eyes that made me understand he wasn't only trapped by what he might feel. He was trapped by what he'd promised himself. Theo took a slow breath. You shouldn't be in this. I swallowed. Maybe, I replied. But I was in the room when he fell. Caleb's eyes flicked to me again, gratitude and fear mixed. Theo's voice dropped. If you say one more thing about feelings, I'm going to. To what? I asked. Theo stared at the fireplace, opening like the darkness that could give him instructions. When he answered, it wasn't brave in the way people in movies are brave. It was brave in the way real people are brave. Messy, delayed, honest, because there was no other option. Theo said, I'm going to admit that I'm jealous. Caleb looked stunned. I felt my own face warm. Theo continued, voice shaky. Not jealous, like, of you, Miles, he said, then corrected himself mid-sentence like he didn't want to use my name too casually. Jealous that he found someone to hold him up who's not me. My stomach dropped. I wasn't prepared to be turned into a solution for someone else's pain. I wanted to be chosen. I didn't want to be borrowed. Caleb whispered, Theo. Theo looked at him, and the look was raw. I keep telling myself I'm straight, so I can pretend this is friendship. But when he looked at me in the ambulance, his voice broke on the edge of a truth. He hadn't practiced. I waited, breathing carefully. Theo swallowed, then said, I wanted to kiss him. The words landed like a glass that didn't shatter but cracked through its center. Caleb stared, stunned and devastated in the same breath. I didn't know what to do with the new reality. That Theo had been close to something honest for so long, he mistook it for danger. Caleb's voice was barely audible. And you didn't. Theo's eyes filled. I didn't, because I'm straight, he said again. But the sentence didn't sound like certainty now. It sounded like a child clinging to a rule. Caleb reached slowly for Theo's hand, and Theo didn't pull away. Caleb said, You can't keep using that word like it's a bandage. It's not stopping the bleeding. Theo's jaw trembled. Then what am I supposed to do? Caleb's answer came after a long silence. Tell the truth, even if it changes everything. Theo's eyes flicked to me, as if I was a mirror he could hide behind. I don't want to ruin your life, Theo said. My throat tightened. The truth was, I didn't want to be ruined. I wanted to be loved in a way that didn't require pretending to be someone else. I said, Your truth won't ruin it. My fear already did. Caleb looked at me like he understood what I meant, like the accident had cracked open the same door inside us. Theo's breathing slowed. He looked at Caleb's hand, and then at Caleb's face. For a moment, he looked like he might run away from his own confession. Instead, he leaned forward and rested his forehead against Caleb's knuckles. Caleb closed his eyes, and his expression softened into something almost peaceful. But the moment didn't turn into romance in the way people expect. It didn't become a kiss, didn't become a neat scene. It became a quiet decision to stop pretending. Theo whispered, "I can't keep being the man who says straight when my body says otherwise." Caleb opened his eyes and looked at him. "Then don't." I felt tears burn behind my eyes, not because I was watching a happy moment, but because I was watching courage without guarantees. And then, the emotional shift hit me unexpected and sharp. Caleb turned his gaze to me. "What do you want, Miles?" he asked. Hearing my name in that room felt like stepping into sunlight. I swallowed. My brain tried to build defenses. It said, "Slow down, don't want too much, don't scare them, don't make Theo's confession about you." But my chest refused, I said, quietly but clearly. "I want to stop pretending I don't feel it too." Caleb's eyes widened slightly. "But..." Theo lifted his head, looking at me with something like fear and hope at the same time. I forced myself to keep going because I'd already found the courage. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a decision. "I've been thinking about you since before you fell," I admitted to Caleb. "Not just because you needed help, because when you look at people, it's like you're asking if they'll stay." Caleb's lips parted. He looked stunned, like the accident hadn't only injured him, it had rearranged his ability to trust. Theo's expression turned complicated. I could see the conflict. Protect Caleb, protect himself, and keep his own truth from swallowing them all. Caleb took a breath, slow. "I stayed inside the house after I broke it," he whispered, voice trembling. "I kept working because I thought if I could finish the renovation, I could fix myself. But I didn't." He looked at Theo, then back at me. "I didn't get saved by the work." Theo's voice was barely a sound. "So what saved you?" Caleb's eyes glistened. "That you were there," he said, and then he added something I didn't expect. "And that he didn't leave." Theo's jaw tightened, as if he was trying not to crumble. The rain kept tapping on the window, steady as a heartbeat. Then the room shifted again, gentler. Caleb asked Theo, "Do you want to try being honest with us?" Theo blinked, face crumpling slightly. "With you and him?" he asked, voice broken by the sheer audacity of hope. Caleb's answer was immediate. "Not like a performance," he said, "like a beginning." Theo stared at Caleb's face, like he was trying to decide whether hope was dangerous. When Theo finally spoke, he sounded like someone stepping onto new ground. "I'm not going to claim labels tonight," he said. "I'm not going to say straight to make myself comfortable." He looked at me, then Caleb. "I'm going to tell the truth," Theo continued. "That I wanted to keep you alive, that I wanted to keep you close, and that I think I'm done lying to survive." I felt something unlock inside me. It wasn't romance as much as it was permission. Caleb let out a shaky breath. "Then stay," he said. Theo nodded, and in that nod there was a promise, small, human, real. That night, when the rain eased and the farmhouse creaked in the quiet, we sat together in the living room. Theo brought blankets. Caleb dozed in short bursts. I kept an eye on his pain meds schedule, like it was my responsibility to keep him safe. But when Caleb fell asleep, Theo turned to me with a look that felt like it had been waiting years. He whispered, "You're not going to run." It wasn't a question. It was a test. One last test to see if my honesty could survive the next moment. I met his gaze and said, "I'm already here. I can't go back to not feeling." Theo's lips trembled, and his eyes filled again. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. I swallowed. "Then we learn." Theo's breath hitched, and he leaned forward slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted. He pressed his forehead to mine, first, soft, cautious, reverent. Only then did he let his hand come up to my cheek, thumb brushing my skin like he was confirming I was real. It wasn't a kiss. It was something like a vow. I could feel my heart racing, but my mind was clear. This was the kind of intimacy that asked permission, even while it asked for love. Later, when Caleb woke and saw the tenderness between Theo and me, he didn't smile like someone winning. He smiled like someone relieved. "I don't want you to pretend," Caleb said, voice thick. Theo looked at him. "I'm not." Caleb nodded, then looked at me. "And you?" he asked. I took a breath. "I'm not." The words felt simple after everything, but they also felt like stepping into a future without a map. Over the weeks that followed, the farmhouse purchase moved forward in pieces. The closing date got delayed because of Caleb's recovery. Insurance forms multiplied. Contractors rescheduled. The house began to look less like a project and more like a home with a pulse. Caleb got stronger. Theo's presence became consistent in a way that made it impossible to call it casual. He didn't announce himself as someone new. He didn't chase a dramatic label. He simply stopped lying. And Caleb stopped pretending his pain was private. He told me one evening while the sun set behind the trees that the accident wasn't the first time he'd felt his life nearly end. "Before the fall," Caleb confessed, voice low, "I was drowning in the quiet parts. I thought if I sold the farmhouse, I'd escape the feeling, like it was attached to the beams." He kicked at the dirt lightly. "But then you came, and you looked at me like you saw the human, not the project." I listened, letting his honesty wash through me. "And Theo," Caleb continued, "kept showing up even when it would have been easier to stay in the story people expect." I asked gently, "What story is that?" Caleb's smile was sad. "Straight neighbor. Helpful man. Safe distance." He paused, and then he looked at me with a kind of fearless tenderness. But he wasn't safe distance from me. He was close enough to save my life. I felt tears rise again, not because it was sad, but because it was real. Theo, standing a few feet away with a wrench in his hand, heard Caleb's words and didn't pretend he didn't. He walked toward us and set the wrench down carefully, like he was putting down the tools of his old defense. Theo said, "I'm afraid sometimes." Caleb's eyes softened. "Of what?" Theo swallowed. "Of being wrong. Of being the kind of man who confuses the world by wanting what he wants." I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on my knees. "Wanting isn't wrong," I said. Theo looked at me, and something in his expression made me understand he'd been starving for someone to say it without a lecture. Caleb reached out and took Theo's hand. "Then stop starving," Caleb whispered. Theo's throat moved, as if he was fighting tears. That night, after the last paperwork was signed and the keys were finally in my pocket, Theo and Caleb stood on the farmhouse porch together. The sky was clear, and the stars looked too sharp to be real. The house behind us smelled like fresh paint and rain-damp wood. The world felt new, not because the past vanished, but because we finally stopped treating it like a threat. We didn't make a grand speech. We didn't do a dramatic relationship reveal. We simply stood close enough that our shoulders touched, and the warmth between us felt like a choice. Caleb's voice was quiet. "I didn't plan for love." Theo laughed softly, but it broke on the edges. Neither did I. I looked at them and admitted the truth that had grown in my chest since the fall. "I thought I was buying a farmhouse," I said, "but it feels like I bought a chance to be honest." Theo's gaze locked on mine. I nodded. "I love you," I told Theo, and I didn't add apologies. Caleb exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. Not because it was easy, but because it was finally accurate. Theo's eyes filled. He didn't reach for Caleb first. He didn't claim. He simply stepped closer to me until our foreheads almost touched, and then he whispered, "I'm trying. I'm really trying." Caleb's hand found Theo's shoulder, steady and warm. "Then we'll try together," Caleb said. And when we walked inside the newly owned house, 3 men moving around unfinished spaces that now felt safe, We didn't pretend the accident had been the beginning of our lives. We acknowledged what it actually was. A doorway. A moment, the world tilted. A chance to stop using labels as armor and to tell the truth while there was still time to be held.